Annalena Baerbock, thank you so much for joining us on Euronews. The first question, and this is really a statement, perhaps not even to get political, but it really has shocked Europeans, is that statement from the president of the U.S. suggesting that a civilization could be wiped out. Beyond the politics, the Pope talked about a question of morality. Is that something that you can support and rally behind?
Well, human rights and international law is based on our common understanding of humanity, on our moral grounds, because the United Nations was built on the massacres of the Second World War, on a genocide committed by my own country, Germany, against Jews, and the murdering worldwide. And this is why this debate about that international law would be something theoretical and we would not need it. We have unfortunately heard it also from some European governments, is first of all not based in our history, because it has always been the same side of our common understanding of humanity.
And you say it's being attacked, and some would argue it's no longer even being applied across the world. We've entered now into a new era, perhaps. But who is going to defend it? Is the UN still capacitated to play this role?
The UN is not a single individual actor. It's the composition of 193 very diverse member states. And as we all know, we also have the Security Council, where 5 member states have a special responsibility. But unfortunately, in these times, they do not all take up their responsibility, but take their veto rights, which they also have, to defend even the breach of international law. And this is why the rest of the international community is needed so much to come together. And yes, we see this defense of international law. For example, the Central Asian state, they find an agreement on the disputes over borders, which they had for decades, just in the last year, combining also with cooperation on water. And this is especially the strength of the United Nations to prevent a crisis of even getting bigger. Unfortunately, as we see it around the world, it's not possible everywhere, especially if P5 members to decide to do the opposite.
And of course, you mentioned this veto and some countries that do not use it responsibly. That's clearly a reference to Russia. We've seen much criticism over the past year suggesting that the UN is part of the problem, that the UN has not been able to adapt to new times, that the UN has not been able to resolve any major conflict over the past 2 years, and that it has become obsolete. Is that fair criticism?
Without any doubt, the UN needs a deep reform, but we're in the midst of this reform. It's called UN 80. Since 17 years, we are trying to reform the Security Council. We just touched with the veto initiative, but unfortunately, it needs the agreement also by the members of the Security Council. And I always relate a bit to the national context, because, for example, also in all our European countries, we have clear rules that you should not kill anybody. Unfortunately, murder still happens. And nobody would say, okay, we should just get rid of the criminal code now because we could not prevent the murders. But police and the work in society has to as much as to counter it. And it's the same for the United Nations. We have to do every day to be better than the day before, but we heavily depend on the member states. And if a member state starts a war of aggression, then it's not the UN failing, or the charter is not clear enough that this is not allowed, but it's member states who is in well awareness of breaching the charter, pressing this war forward. And this is why it needs the counter pressure from other member states as well. And there's a quote of one of the former Secretary General, which I think is important to remember what the UN is for. It says, the UN was built not to bring humanity to heaven, but to prevent humanity from hell. So it's not to have the perfect place, but in dire crisis, like we are seeing right now, for example, the war in Ukraine or the war we had in Gaza, that still the UN is delivering food, that they are rebuilding energy, that they are providing schools for children where the schools have been destroyed. Half of the children worldwide would not have been vaccinated without the UN. So there's so much more work than the obviously big fault that we have a blockage in the Security Council.
The U.S., President Trump, I say this because they have been incredibly vocal about saying the UN has not simply solved anything over the past 2 years. Ukraine, not fixed it. In the Gulf, not doing much. With Gaza, all of this criticism, do you take it as fair, or do you ultimately go, well, yes, the UN may not be working in the way that it should be because it's not being given the tools, or just simply because it's being sabotaged, not just by Russia, but also an attempt by the U.S. to make it simply not relevant anymore?
If you use a veto that you cannot come to a decision in a Security Council and then you complain that you could not come to an agreement, obviously it's also the responsibility of those who are casting a veto, and especially with regard to the Middle East and the situation in Gaza. It has been many times the US administration casting a veto. But we have seen, and I don't want to sugarcoat anything, I see every day the shortcomings of the work here in this House. Yet my task and the role of those who believe in international law is to try even harder, even in the darkest time. And we have seen, for example, with the situation in Gaza, when a majority of member states took it in their hands, it was France and Saudi Arabia organizing the so-called two-state solution conference in September. 140 states followed, having a big debate. And this was a moment when also the US administration, the current president, moved and said, okay, I invite the Gulf countries to DC, and then he brought also resolution to the Security Council. So also with regard to the ceasefire in Gaza, it's based on a resolution on the Security Council. I believe it could have been stronger implemented if the UN had a bigger role in it, but they decided differently.
How do you see globally, internationally, the mediation role that the EU can play? Because, again, going back to what seems to be perennial criticism is that Europe is too slow and simply not effective enough. Is that something, when you look at it externally, that you say it's unfair? The Europeans are still playing a leading role, or are we also becoming obsolete?
Having been also a European foreign minister before, I know that Europe can move fast. When the invasion of Ukraine happened by Russia, it was over a weekend when all the EU 27 came together and put up a sanction package before the markets opened again. So we have seen, especially also in the European Union, that under pressure, they can be very quick and they can be very targeted. And it needs a strong European role, as it needs also a very strong African Union role in those times, because both continents know also from their past and the suffering in the past that the multilateral order is their best protection. And compared to the whole world, 27 states, it's not the majority, but the EU, especially together with its member states, is one of the biggest donors of the UN. So therefore, I encourage also EU partners to engage strongly in the reform process, because they have a strong influence also how we make this institution more fit for purpose and better prepared for the future.
The reason why I ask about the inner workings of the EU when it comes to external action is that there is now a criticism and even a call for reform within the EU to skip unanimity and do things on a qualified majority basis. Is that something externally, based on your two opinions, your time as foreign minister and now the UN, that you can support? Qualified majority as a way to implement fast foreign policy?
The debate about qualified majority voting has been there for a long time in the EU, and it was always the position of Germany to support it. Also lately in the field of foreign politics, because we know also, for example, for the enlargement process, how difficult it is to enlarge, also with the Western Balkan states, for example, at the moment, if there has to be unanimity at every single step. So my point of view that it's in the self-interest of the EU to be faster and stronger, and also in the interest of the United Nations, which I'm serving right now, because a strong European voice committed to international law is also strengthening the UN. But I would say in these times where things are very controversial, it should be also thought worth to say the EU is speaking on behalf of 27. However, individual member states are echoing this position to hear loud and clear that it's not only one voice, but the common voice of 27, because obviously sometimes in debates it really needs a majority which might be tight, because we are not guaranteed that we have the strong majorities automatically.
Look into the future of the United Nations. There is now clearly a contest to find the next Secretary General in this very complex global scenario, also knowing what has been at times, some would argue, very personal criticism of the current Secretary General. How would you define the character, the qualities, the skills that the next Secretary General should have?
I would say it's the most difficult job in the world you can have in these times, because if you have to serve 193 member states, which are in open conflict to each other, at least some of them, it's extremely hard, but it's also the most important job. And the face of the next Secretary General will also say where the United Nations is standing for. For example, serving all the 8 billion people, of which half are women. In 8 decades, we never had a female Secretary General. So if you're in an institution speaking about equality and human rights, it's also a question why so far there's never been a woman being elected.
You would personally advocate for a woman?
Not myself personally, but member states agreed that they called strongly for the nomination of women in unanimity. And if now it's not delivering on this one, obviously, it's also a question of credibility. There's also a strong call for leadership, because in these times you need leadership, you need experience in international institution, and you need to have the capability to build bridges in this fragmented times.
Do you consider that the Board of Peace could become a challenger, a contender to the UN, or is that something that you simply do not see will be a credible rival in the future? It cannot outlast the UN.
There's a good reason that at the UN, every member state, no matter how big or small, how powerful, has an equal seat at the table. And this is unique responsibility and also the unique role the UN can play. And member states made very clear, also those who joined the Board of Peace, that this is only with regard to Gaza, and for any other matter on peace and security, it's for a good reason, the United Nations, where you don't have to pay because you're representing the people of your country, and everybody is equal.
Of course, and that echoes also the concerns of the EU, which has manifested to those legal concerns and the fees. Annalena Baerbock, thank you so much for joining us on Euronews.
Thanks a lot. Have a good day.